This conference will now be recorded.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Hi, thanks everyone for coming here today. We're looking forward to sharing the results so far as we near the end of the RA21 project. The reason that we're at this point is thanks in no small way to many of the people in this room. So thanks everybody who's contributed to this. So the format today, we'll have a number of presentations covering a variety of aspects pertinent to the project, including the results, and then we will at the end have a discussion panel where all our presenters will be on the panel. So I would ask you all to note your questions down and keep them until the discussion panel at the end. Our first presenter actually comes from an initiative that started prior to RA21. The PDR Pharma documentation ring realised that access was important to them, and in discussions with the CCC had a forum, formed a task force, and then I'm pleased to say joined RA21 as our corporate pilot. And the presentation is going to be made by Helen Malone from PDR and GSK. Helen is Director of the Global Information Hub. Over to you, Helen.
Thank you very much, Julia. Hi everyone, I'm Helen Malone. As Julia said, I'm the Director of the Global Information Hub at GSK, and I'm also the President of the PDR. I've really enjoyed being part of this important RA21 initiative, and I'm actually here today to give you the customer perspective on improving access to subscribed content. So for scientists trying to access their subscriptions on the move, we've long really realized as an information community that we've long felt we needed something better than IP. So in particular, the pharmaceutical industry's information community, the Pharma Documentation Ring, or the PDR, is extremely interested in helping to move this issue forward. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the PDR, it's a community of knowledge managers from the 28 commercial pharmaceutical companies listed on this slide. And we collaborate on strategic issues and opportunities, such as the one on improved user access that we're talking about today. And back in June 2015, we held a special meeting on authentication, which brought together the PDR member companies and also our external information partners. And this is what we collectively decided we would need. So firstly, in terms of a solution, we thought we'd focus on single sign-on and open standards, which would enable access both inside and outside the corporate network. And secondly, we thought that we would like all publishers to adopt this new authentication standard, ideally provide granular usage statistics, and also to work with us on privacy and security considerations. So these requirements evolved into the three main goals for the RA21 corporate pilot. Firstly, and most importantly, to improve the user login experience at publisher websites. Secondly, to explore ways to capture granular usage statistics. And thirdly, to investigate how to easily set up and maintain single sign-on with multiple publishers. These are the 5 PDR pharma companies and also the 4 publishers who took part in our corporate pilot. And for me personally, one of the main highlights from the pilot is how well we all work together in partnership in such a collaborative way. So in summary, this is what we really want to get to. Happy users who are able to access their subscriptions anytime, anywhere, on any device in a simple, compliant way. So I'm now going to pass over to Ralph Youngen from ACS, who will explain more about the progress that's been made. So thank you very much.
Thanks. Thanks, Helen. Okay. Well, everyone, I'm Ralph Youngen from the American Chemical Society. Chris Shillham sitting beside me here from Elsevier. We're the co-chairs of RA21. We're going to take you through a little bit of an introduction, a little bit more background on RA21. Frankly, why do we need RA21? Let's start right there. I think that we all realize that when we look at our own workforces, it's becoming much more geographically diverse, that people are now able to work anywhere, any place, anytime. And research consumption has followed suit. Researchers no longer access content strictly when they are within the walls of their campus or corporate environment. They're accessing research content while on mobile devices. The little graph that I have inset here in the diagram shows the mobile device use on the ACS web platform over years, and you'll see it's increasing pretty significantly. But the publishing community really has not kept pace with providing a good means of accessing research content while the scientists are off of a campus or corporate network. So this is largely why RA21 has come to be. So the scholarly publishing community has tried several things to help overcome this problem. Very prevalent in the library space are now our proxy or VPN servers that are implemented. I pulled the Ohio State instruction page here for how to configure your VPN or proxy server, and let's just say it's not exactly easy. It says you either have to install a bookmarklet in your browser ahead of time, or if you want to, there's a string there that you can copy and paste and put into the front of the URL on a publisher site, and hopefully that might work sometimes. And then it says if you're a VPN user, don't even try. It's not even going to work. So the focus groups that we have with many of our users, we hear all the time that proxy servers are problematic. They require me to do something ahead of time. If I'm off campus, if I'm at home, if I'm someplace and I haven't already installed that bookmarklet, I'm largely out of luck. Publishers have also tried to do what's called device pairing. This is particularly when mobile devices were becoming more prevalent. So in this context, when someone is on campus and has a campus IP address on like the campus Wi-Fi with their phone or tablet, they can effectively cache their entitlements with that mobile device, so that then when they're not on the campus Wi-Fi, that entitlement caching still provides them with access to the content. And then the other method that we'll talk about that came up last year is Google's CASA, Campus Activated Subscriber Access. Kind of the same pattern. If I am on campus and I log in with my Google account and I have a campus IP address, this leverages the fact that publishers have contributed our subscribers' IP addresses to Google so that they can provide more straightforward access from Google Scholar. And what this effectively does then is caches that campus entitlement with your Google account, so that when you are then off campus, if you log into your Google account, you can kind of have that entitlement cache as well with you. So a couple things to note here. Every one of these methods underlying still relies on the IP recognition as the means of authorizing access to content. And I think even more importantly, they all require the user to do something in advance. Once again, if you are off campus, if you're not on your campus or corporate network, and you want to access research that you are entitled to, if you haven't done these configurations ahead of time, you are effectively out of luck. So we think there's got to be a better way, and I'll turn over to Chris to talk about that.
Sure. Well, good morning, everybody. Again, I'm Christian with Elsevier, and I think it's well understood or well commented upon for many years that there has to be a better way to provide access to users to the resources they're entitled to, as Helen put very well, anywhere, anytime, from any device. So it turns out that there is a technology that's fairly well established and is very mature that solves most of the hard problems here. It's a technology called SAML, Security Assertion Markup Language. It's been around for 15 plus years, and essentially this allows service providers such as publishers to receive secure authentication assertion from identity providers such as corporations and academic institutions who are customers of these service providers. Some of the nice characteristics of SAML are that it supports multilateral trust, right? So we have a many-to-many problem here. We have many service providers, publishers, etc. We have many identity providers. One of the nice things and the unique things about SAML at the moment is it supports this multilateral federation. So those trust relationships can be established without having to have bilateral agreements between all of the parties involved here. It's a mature technology, as I mentioned. It's very well established in the academic space. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. Also very well supported by the publisher community. Most publishers implemented SAML many years ago, and increasingly widely adopted in corporations with the rise of software as a service platforms, things like Microsoft Office 365, Azure Active Directory. Increasingly, corporations are using SAML-based authentication to manage access to cloud resources that they provide for their employees. So that sounds great, right? What's the problem? And the problem and the barrier, we think, to adoption of SAML, particularly in our use case, where the user often arrives at the service provider from a point of discovery, a Google search, a PubMed search, etc., is that what we call the identity provider discovery process, the ability of saying, hey, I want to sign in via GSK, I want to sign in via UCL, whatever your home institution is horrible. And we all have, as service providers, these UIs that try to get users through that process. This is an example from our Science Direct. We know this is difficult, and we know users struggle with this. So pretty early in the discussions around RA21, we realized that the path forward was to make use of SAML and to use this kind of established capability, but we really had to fix the user experience problem. So that takes us into our goals for the project, which are really to test pilot a number of approaches to improving that user experience, then to turn those around and provide best practice guidelines for the community to implement those learnings from those pilots. We're in the process of doing that, and they'll be going out shortly. We'll talk about that a little bit later for review by the NISO recommended practice process. And a new goal that we added about 6 months ago, we realized based on the outputs of the pilots, that in order to provide some sharing of identity provider choice, we needed to establish some small slice of central shared infrastructure. So we added a goal to the project to try and establish that infrastructure, find a home for it, find a governance model for that to support it going forward. And we'll talk about that again a little later on. So we've had great support and participation over individuals from over 60 institutions across academic library space, identity providers, publishers, corporations have participated. And one of the great things about this project has actually been bringing those communities together. So I think we've really had some great relationships established, particularly with the identity management community in the academic space. And we've discovered that all the pieces to solve the problem existed. We just needed to kind of join the dots and get people working together. An interesting thing, particularly in the academic space, that I learned fairly recently, is that the problem we're trying to solve here is not unique to publishers of scholarly information resources. It's also a very similar problem in research collaborations. So there's a group called FIM4R, Federated Identity Management for Researchers. This is a grouping of research collaborations across multiple disciplines, and they've actually gone to the time and effort to write a couple of white papers to say, look, if we're trying to get access to shared facilities, think of big radio telescopes or grid computing resources or nuclear physics resources, we have the same problem, right? We need to be able to both authenticate ourselves and authenticate as or be credentialed by our institutions as members of their community. Similarly, with contributions to things like data commons, life scientists increasingly are collaborating, sharing their data sets. They've set up very rich and well-used data platforms to share this data. And again, they need to better authenticate to these things. So they've written a couple of white papers, and they've essentially challenged the identity management community with making this work for them, so that they don't have to take time setting up authentication infrastructure. They don't have to take time figuring out how to get access to these resources. It can be seamless. And one of the many things that they've identified is that the discovery problem needs to be solved. And we're very keen in RA21 to see the recommended practices we've come up with adopted as broadly as possible across the whole of the kind of scholarship space. Also worth referencing something we've been asked a lot. There's a crop of new, what we think of as access broker tools, who've also tried to solve the same problem. Things like Copernio, Anywhere Access, CASA, which Ralph already mentioned. So we're often asked, well, what's the difference between RA21? Why do you need to do RA21 if these tools exist? I think we published a position statement on this. Okay. We published a position statement on this a few months ago. We think there are differences. We also think they're compatible. But the way I tend to think of it is that the access broker tools are trying to manage the complexity in the access landscape, the VPNs, the proxies, the current channel authentication systems, and hide that for the users. And that's a good, laudable, and helpful thing to do. What we're trying to do with RA21, which is maybe a little bit of a long-term goal, and has taken a little bit more coordination and heavy lifting, is to say, actually, there isn't really a need for that complexity anymore. Let's make it go away. When we think we have the right approach here, we hope to now see adoption and take up of that approach. So last slide for me, how did we structure the project? What have we been doing? We started off with 3 pilot projects, the corporate pilot, which Helen talked about, and a couple of what we termed academic pilots that were really investigating different technical approaches to the problems we're trying to solve. Those pilots have all concluded now, and you'll find the reports from those pilots available on the RA21 website. We then set up a couple of kind of cross-cutting work streams across all of those technical approaches and segment approaches. One was looking at security and privacy, with great input from a lot of folks in the security communities in the participating organizations. The output of that is also published on RA21.org as a report. And the final work stream, which we're wrapping up right now, is the user experience work stream. So we conducted multiple rounds of user testing. Ralph will go into that in more detail. We've got a little bit more to do just to finalize things, and we're in the process of starting to draft the NISA recommended practice, which we hope will be out for public comment in Q1 next year. And with that, I will hand over to Ralph to talk about the recommendations.
Thanks, Chris. So as Chris noted, RA21, much of the effort with the RA21 initiative is around improving the user experience. And in particularly, we have a bit of a challenge here because the user experience today for a researcher that is on a campus or corporate network is incredibly seamless, right? I mean, you simply click and get access to the content because you are IP recognized. So our challenge is to try to make that as seamless as possible, but in a way that will work anywhere, anytime, any place, but also preserve user privacy like we enjoy today with IP recognition. So if you look at a typical research discovery workflow, we know that researchers start with a tool of their own choosing. There is no one path to find relevant research. So I've listed a few of those tools that are commonly used today here. No matter what kind of tool you use, you're going to come up with a list of candidate articles of interest. And the list of articles is going to be from multiple publishers. So in this case, I've shown here that the first one is an Elsevier article, the next is from ProQuest, and then the third is an ACS article. And as I say, when you are on campus, access couldn't be more seamless. You simply get access to the content directly from the publisher site. But what we are finding through discussions with our users and focus groups is this is typically the pattern that happens when you are off of a campus or corporate network. Researchers follow the path of least resistance in order to try to find the content, and rather than navigating the complexities of proxy servers or access brokers or the existing SAML infrastructure that publishers support, rather than do that, they are simply turning to sites like Sci-Hub in order to obtain the content that they are perfectly entitled to obtain. So what we want to do is, with RA21, is to route off-campus and corporate access through the user's home institution. And that works equally well in the case of academic institution like Oxford University, or corporate setting like where Helen is from, like Glaxo. So why is this privacy preserving then? Because after all, if the users are going to be logging in at their home institution, how is this a privacy preserving environment? Well, it is because the publishers don't actually see the identity of the individual. With the way SAML works, what we would see are attributes of that person. And one of those attributes is an opaque identifier that is a number that is unique to that person for a particular publisher, but not across publishers. So you see here I've noted, you know, that number is different in across the different publisher sites. So there's no ability for publishers to try to get together and, you know, aggregate usage patterns or something like that. But note, I've also put another attribute, could be something here like, okay, what is the role of that person on campus? And this is actually a robust taxonomy that we can start to leverage here, where we could begin to differentiate between students accessing versus faculty versus emeritus faculty and things of that nature. That kind of attribute environment is something that we are also looking to do. Helen mentioned the desire to have more granular usage statistics. Well, you can imagine that if one of those attributes is something that the subscriber actually can set on their own people in terms of how they would like usage to be reported back. So in the case I have here, maybe an academic setting might want to differentiate student usage versus faculty usage. And so with these attributes, you could do that. Today, publishers cannot provide granular statistics like that back to our subscribers. But with this attribute technology, we can. Especially in the corporate space, we're hearing that they would like to be able to maybe assign like department codes, to their different corporate researchers, so that they can do internal billbacks based on usage within their own environment. So this is something that we are absolutely pursuing and looking forward to. All right, so let me talk a bit about the user experience approach that we've taken. Big call out here as well to ProQuest for providing the professional facilitation. We've got some really good user experience folks from ProQuest that are leading this thread. And they've taken a very traditional approach to developing the user experience by mapping out personas and workflows and building prototypes and then doing a lot of user testing. We have, you'll see on the slide here noted all the different user testing that we've done both in the corporate and academic setting and across many different countries. These are the building blocks of the new user experience that we are developing. So first and foremost is a consistent visual cue, a visual call to action, or this button that publishers would place on their website. A very smart, flexible search environment that allows people to find their home institution very conveniently. And then very important, once you find your home institution, once you do that one time, you don't ever have to do it again, because we save your choice in your browser. So it's not saved locally, centrally someplace, it's saved in your browser. So just to reinforce that a bit, here's what this looks like. The very first time you go to a publisher site, when you've never logged in through RA21 before, that button says access through your institution. You click on it. You do a simple search to find your institution. Once you've gone through that process and logged in through your institution, that button then kind of magically changes. When you go to other publisher sites or when you come back to the same site, that button now recognizes your home institution. So you simply click on that button on other sites or future visits, and it will seamlessly take you back to your home institution. If you are already logged in, you don't have to log in again. If not, you will be prompted to enter your username and password on your home institution and then get access to the content. So let me try to do a demo here of that user experience. You didn't tell me that. I got it. Okay, so this is a live demo. The authentication framework is real. This is a mocked up Google Scholar search result, and the publisher sites are not real, but it'll give you a flavor for how we are making this work. So if I click on this first link here, this is an Elsevier article, and as I say, this is the first time that I've never logged in through the RA21 ecosystem in the past, so this button says access through your institution. So if I click on that, I would go to this search environment. And the reason that we say this is a smart search environment, if I type something like Massachusetts, start typing it, I can see all of the institutions here that have Massachusetts in the name of the institution itself. But let's say, if I'm from MIT, I don't type Massachusetts, I just type MIT. Well, that works as well, because MIT in their email domain, mit.edu is their email domain. So even though that string is not in the name of the institution because it is in their email domain, that works as well. And as I say, this is real. Let me just click on that link, and you'll see this is the honest, real, live MIT login page. So if I had an account here, I could log in and then get access to that content. Since I do not have an account there, I will come back here and clear that choice and log in through our very prestigious RA21 institution, which our friends at Open Athens have set up for us. Oh, you know what, Heather? I didn't think about the fact that I have to remember my password. Not on my own laptop when I normally do these. Boy, I hope I remember.
You could use mine if you don't.
Yeah, we'll use Chris's if I have trouble here. Look at that. Okay. So you'll see I'm back now on Elsevier's site, and it says that I have access through the RA21 test institution. So now here's where the magic works. If I go to the second link on my Google Scholar result, this is taking me to the ProQuest site, but you'll see that that button has now changed dynamically. It says access through RA21 test IDP. All I have to do is click on that button, and I have access. I didn't have to log in again because I'm already logged in back at my home institution, and so I simply get access to the content. Same way, if I go to another publisher site, this one being the ACS, and I click on that button that has changed for me, I get access. That is about as seamless as we think we can make the user experience. And this is live working in code, so this is proven that we can actually make this work. Okay. So a couple things about findings here from the user experience. In the testing that we've done from this, people generally are very, very favorable. They find it a very easy experience, especially that consistent visual cue that all publishers would have on their sites. The really interesting thing to note in some of the user testing that we've done is that once a user gets it, once they click on that access through your institution button and go through the process one time, they really understand. And then they start looking for that button everywhere. They start looking for that button on other sites. So the great thing here about the way this is going to be rolled out is that it doesn't matter where the user encounters that button for the first time and goes through that process. Once they are kind of mentally into the system, they understand it, and so they can go across publishers and work, and it'll work very well. Part of the recommendations that are being written that Chris mentioned, we'll go through that NISO process, is going to be also just about positioning of that button, about not confusing the user with too many other options, because this is probably going to be the primary access option that users will go through. And so because right now publisher sites are very inconsistent in the way that these access options are presented. So that's all to be coming out first quarter of next year when that recommended practice document gets ratified. All right, with that, I think we are ready to turn over to Dan, who's a member of our steering committee.
Thank you.
All right, so my name is Dan Ayala. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer for ProQuest, but I want to talk a little, not just about security, but also just about the general thoughts. We're one of the service providers that would implement RA21, and through the course of this project, it's become, there have been some themes that we continue to talk about, things we've learned, not necessarily outcomes of the technology, but more indirect outcomes, things that we think about either as publishers or about our users or as service providers. I guess first and foremost, the underpinning thing here is that usage is king. Everything drives usage. Usage is good for publishers. The more people use the services, the better the services are. Usage is good for researchers. The more researchers have easy access to content, the more and better research they'll be able to do. And so using technology that researchers and publishers are familiar with, using SAML, using industry standards, but also for researchers, directing it back to an infrastructure that they know and trust. I can't help but go back to security on so many of these things. It's my nature. We live in an era where phishing happens all the time, where people are presented with screens that look very much like their institution but aren't, or if they see something that's out of character, they might just abandon. We're teaching them to abandon. So to use university or corporate infrastructure that they know and trust and is exactly the same as they would use when they go to their HR system or go to their grades system means that they're going to be more inclined to continue through, or even more likely, they'll already be logged into that when they come to do their research and make this process even more seamless. Perhaps even bypass for the day that login screen that Ralph showed because they were already there. One of the things that we talk about a lot is Sci-Hub. Sci-Hub is there, and Chris made the mention that they're going there for access they already have. Why? Because it's easy. It really is easy to use. This makes even more compelling reason to come back to use the legitimate sources. Anecdotally, we've started to wonder about the legitimacy of the integrity of the content coming through Sci-Hub as well. Are things being changed along the way? And this is more reinforcement for giving them an easy path to use the technology that's official. But all of this leads to increasing usage both for researchers and then of course, for publishers and service providers as well. Building trust and transparency has been a theme through this whole project. From the outset, we spent a lot of time figuring out good technologies, and then it became clear that there were concerns, that we hadn't done enough to continue to build the trust and we attempted to be transparent, but we realized we needed to be even more transparent about the way data is going to be used, the controls in place, the interactions with the library. And so we've spent a lot of time building that level of trust and transparency across the project. That said, it's also very difficult. I think we've come to the realization that it's very difficult to use existing authentication technologies beyond the fact that it's a single point of entry into enterprises or into publishers, and when something goes wrong, you have to lop off the entire organization, and that benefits no one. Even beyond that, though, the ability to count on IP addresses as an accurate definition of geography, which a lot of us count on, things that are country specific or location specific, we are not able to do that as much anymore, and it will continue to decrease as the IP version 4 space runs out of addresses. It's becoming, people are putting together band-aids to try and keep it working, and it makes it even more cloudy. So all of this leads to, comes back to trust. We need to be able to trust the information we get about users, and users need to be able to know that they're going to get to the content that they're paying, that their institutions are paying for. And doing it on an individual basis feels like the best way to do so. At the same time, we're also working against a consumer space in which people have lost trust in the companies that are out there that are data companies. And this is an academic world. This is a library-driven world in which privacy really is king. And going out of our way to make sure that we are clear about how data is and is not being used, to take steps to isolate the various publishers so that information couldn't be provided. We have no intention of doing it, but how can we isolate those things further to make it crystal clear and build that relationship and build that trust even better? I think over the course of the project, we've actually grown closer and understand the needs of libraries even better and of researchers even better, and have started to think about ways to work with libraries to help them break down some of the issues that exist even within the institutions, be it between libraries and IT, be it between configurations in SAML, or misconceptions that exist about how some of the technology works. And the last thing, I think what I've realized is the importance of truly being involved in projects like this. This is a great technology project that has allowed a lot of people to have a lot of input into something that's really complex, and trying to negotiate and navigate the needs of bespoke publishers and service providers at the same time as users and librarians to get to a user experience that meets all of those needs. To get to a workflow that meets all of those needs means you have to have a lot of people collaborating. That collaboration adds a sense of commitment on all of the parties to both make it successful, but also to go through and drive it through to implementation. I can talk specifically within ProQuest. The fact that we've been involved in this all along means we've generated a lot of excitement inside the company about what can happen as a result of it, and the value that we can give to customers as a result of it. And I've heard similar across other participants in this project. So I think the underlying message here is that, get involved in these projects, get deeply involved, bring your own experience and expertise to these projects, and the outcomes will likely suit your needs when they come out the other end. And that is actually all I have. Very good. And now Todd Carpenter will talk more about RA21 and libraries.
So good morning, everyone. My name is Todd Carpenter. I'm the Executive Director of NISO, the National Information Standards Organization in the US. I'm going to talk a little bit about the perspective of libraries in RA21 and focusing a little bit on some of the criticisms of RA21 and hopefully responding to some of those criticisms. How many of you are actually librarians? One, two? Okay. What's interesting is I am not a librarian. I work at an organization that is in part a library organization. I attend publisher meetings, I'm seen as the library representative. I attend library meetings, I'm seen as the publisher representative, which makes life really kind of interesting. Yeah, a little bipolar. Some of this has already been discussed. I'm going to breeze pretty quickly through it. We all know about IP authentication. It is primarily focused on where you are from, not who you are. And in large part, this was adopted back when computer operating systems looked a lot like this. If you were working in a Mac environment, or if you were working in a PC environment, if you were working in a Mac environment, it looked kind of like this, rather frightening. And it worked well in an environment where people were plugged into networks, primarily using desktops and working from their offices or libraries. That worked well, except until now. My laptop computer doesn't even have an Ethernet port. Most people are using a variety of devices. They're logging in from a variety of networks. We are creating tremendous problems for IP authentication. This is compounded by the fact that increasingly people are using tablets to access and mobile devices to access the internet. And you could be bouncing from network to network without even being aware that your device is switched over simply because of the quality and strength of the Wi-Fi connection. Your device is instantly switched over to a cellular connection. Your IP, the network in which you are connected to, is inherently unstable. We need better structures so that the process by which we are authenticating people doesn't completely fail. Now, IP authentication, for all its successes and ease, is not actually all that great, even for the library community. IP address authentication the management of that is no small task when you're talking about having to deal with dozens or hundreds of publishers at a large institution. The VPN and proxy systems also need maintenance and upkeep. There are security issues with those systems. Those abound, and those publishers and those libraries are constantly at risk of having those proxy servers shut down because of unauthorized use. And tracking data, as much as libraries like to say that we don't have data on tracking, proxy servers maintain all of that information. It still exists. So it's just handled internally, and libraries have some measure of control over it. So what do patrons want in this process? They want seamless access to content. Let me reiterate that. They want seamless access to content. In case you missed it, they want seamless access to content. Now, there's other things. Okay, privacy, that's kind of nice. Customization, okay, fine, possibly. One password, please. I'm sick of having hundreds of passwords. And did I mention I want seamless access? Now that's slightly different from the expectation of the library community. The library community and the librarians have some other expectations. Librarians have an ethical, often legal responsibility to protect the privacy of patrons, even if the patrons don't care, which is interesting. Their opinion is that data gathering should be minimal. It should be anonymous whenever possible. Now, you can use informed consent if done appropriately to mitigate some of those issues, but this is a huge issue for the library community. Another issue is one of control. This is an article published by Lisa Hinchliffe on the Scholarly Kitchen. Please don't take away my proxy server. Basically, this has everything to do with control, controlling the data of the services, controlling how those services are managed, because inherently passing that management on to the IT department at the university is scary in some respects. And hopefully integration with RA21 into existing technology stack services will help address some of those challenges. But kind of building on this, the notion of the proxy server as a firewall for identity management and privacy goes again to this core issue of control. We control the server, we control the logs. The proxy server protects the patron identity by masking it through IP authentication based on which network you're attached to, not who you are. Now, first of all, this is not always the case. The data does exist, as I mentioned earlier. It exists in the proxy server, which sometimes is managed internally within the library, but in often cases, it's actually managed by a third party. SAML and the identity federation process could do the same thing in terms of minimizing the information that's known about the user, but it's done through a different means, through pseudonymous identifiers and tokens. There is also the IT issues that are prevalent in most libraries. In most institutions, the identity management systems are not run out of the library, they're run out of the centralized IT. They often don't report through the same institutional infrastructures. And IT departments establish norms and best practices that aren't always in keeping with the expectations and values of the library, particularly privacy. For example, SAML is used for authenticating course management systems. That's one of the key use case, or a key use case in many institutions. And in that use case, information about the user has to be sent to the service provider. You have to know who the student is in order to provide the courses and the information about the courses that they're logged into. So the expectation is built within the IT department that your SAML attributes should include information about who this user is. Those are set by defaults. That's not the case in expectation of the library community, and the library community hasn't had those conversations with the IT department, and they feel they don't have that authority to tell the IT department what to do, which is an interesting power dynamic. I'll get to that in a moment. But it also goes, it's one of the causes for some of the conversations that have taken place about SAML and the critique of SAML, in that the IT department is sending attributes about users to publishers. Even though publishers don't want that information, it's set up as a default because you're using a system based on that has other use cases where that identity information is important, even critical. So you need to have a conversation with the IT department to say, oh no, all we want is the pseudonymous token to provide access, nothing else, maybe an attribute of user affiliation. Some other important demands of the library community. This needs to be, at least for a considerable amount of time, a dual stack solution. We cannot move instantly from IP authentication to RA21 and SAML because most institutions don't have the resources to do that. Most institutions don't have the ability to move quickly. So this will have to be a stepwise process. We will encourage development and moving along. We will also need broad adoption by the publishing community because, and this is part of the dual stack solution requirement, we will have to have drivers from the publishers, the service providers, that say, listen, this is the direction we'd like you to move, and we've done all the work for you. Ideally, again, a simple solution, a single solution, not multiple approaches, is the best way to advance adoption. And we'll also need to have support from the vendor community where institutions that don't have those resources can turn to when they have questions or implementation needs. There was an interesting report earlier this year from OhioLink, which is a consortium in the central United States. about interactivity with the library and campus IT. And there was a lot of information in this report about how there is challenges with that relationship. And this is just one of the data points out of this report. Is there someone in the IT department who's dedicated to library support in the campus IT department? And I think it's 85% didn't. And if we're expecting this relationship to develop and the ties between the library and the campus IT department are going to be critical for advancing RA21 and critical for advancing SAML adoption, this relationship has to improve. I also expect increasingly in the next several years that there will be a drive to integrate the disparate IT solutions within a campus institution, simply because of resource constraints. If the economy turns down, institutions are going to look to save money, and having multiple solutions to the same problem isn't going to be tenable. So RA21 could be seen as an opportunity to build better relationships between the libraries and the campus IC staff, and this should be viewed ideally as a good thing. Now, in the last couple minutes that I have, I'm going to talk about some of the criticisms of RA21. One of them, we've heard Sci-Hub. Sci-Hub was a motivator of this project, or at least that's the perceived motivation for the publishing community, at least in the eyes of the librarians. And yes, there's some truth to that. However, it should also be noted, as the start of this seminar was discussed, RA21 developed out of outreach from the library community to the publishing community. The librarians, particularly in the corporate environment, noticed that this is a problem that needs to be addressed, and we need to find better solutions. So it wasn't the publishing community said, oh, this is a great idea, let's foist it on the libraries. The libraries actually did some outreach to the publishers to help push this forward. Another criticism is subscribed access is yesterday's news. The only type of access that people should be concerned about in our community is open access. And open access is absolutely not the end-all be-all of access control issues. Even if you presume that every article was available via open access, there are a variety of other services, other things that libraries do that need access control. And if you have a view that providing access to scholarly journals is the only thing libraries do, you have a very dim view of what libraries do and can provide. And the access for research information that Chris mentioned earlier is a great example of that. There are a whole lot of services that libraries are producing and providing to their patrons that need authenticated access. And then a final criticism of RA21 is this is some nefarious plot by publishers to hoover up all sorts of patron data they want to understand and they want to advertise to the patron community. There's several responses to this. First of all, data released by identity federations is completely under the control of those institutions. They can set the limits on what data is provided to the publisher. That's not under the control of the publisher. In fact, when publishers get data that they don't want, they're like, please stop sending it to us, because it creates considerable problems, particularly in the EU for GDPR reasons. Another is a fundamental misunderstanding of what RA21 is doing. RA21, as you if you've perceived it as better, even if you know there are flaws, you've developed workarounds around those flaws. So the known issues are usually easier to manage than the unknown issues that can be caused by change. This is a natural thing with technology. So finally, going to wrap this up with just some highlights. There is an adopted infrastructure that RA21 is built on within the institutions. It's not always the technology that the library is using, but institutions have had years of experience working with it. SAML is a demonstrably better technology than IP, and RA21 simply just makes sense. So looking forward to continuing the conversation. Chris, I think you're next up.
Yeah. Thanks, Todd. So thanks to Helen and to Dan and to Todd. I think we've got some great perspectives there on the customer view of RA21, the supplier service provider view of RA21, and the library view of RA21. So it's great to see those kind of different angles and perspectives on what we're trying to do here. I'm going to wrap up just by talking a little bit about where we are, what we've got left to do, and what the timeline is, and what some of the implications are for implementation. So we kind of mentioned earlier on the remaining work for RA21 is really oriented around two goals: finishing off the best practice recommendations. So we have, I think, one more round of user testing to do to test some of the final details of the recommendation on the user experience that you saw earlier on. And we are in the process of drafting the best practice in order to get that out for public comment. And we've also kind of broadened the user experience group with input from a lot of different community participants to make sure we're getting as broad a view as possible, because at the end of the day, we're going to be asking participants to stick a UI element on their website, which is always something that's interesting. And then lots of discussions about fonts and colors and typography and all that good stuff. And also mentioned, and I'll go into a bit more detail of that, we're in discussions. In fact, we had a further discussion this afternoon about standing up this thin slice of shared infrastructure. Essentially, we didn't really go into the technical implementation of the UX so far. We can talk about that in the panel if people are interested. But essentially, the magic that makes that button dynamically change and enables that choice of identity provider to be shared across participants is some JavaScript that stores and retrieves that preference from local browser storage, and the JavaScript has to be hosted somewhere. Right? So really what we're talking about with the central infrastructure is who's going to host the JavaScript, and potentially also the discovery service, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later on, but we think it certainly will drive adoption for people with less in-house technical resources to be able to integrate with a shared centralized discovery service. So what does that look like on a timeline? Well, we're aiming to get the recommended practice finalized by the end of Q1 next year. We're aiming to standardize the governance structure for the central infrastructure by the end of Q2, and we're aiming and anticipating that publishers and other service providers will be starting to deploy RA21 recommended practices into their services in the second half of next year. So what will the participants have to do? For institutions, for the identity providers, if they're already members of academic identity management federations, or if they already have existing SAML identity providers stood up, very little, right? There really isn't any work to do there, maybe apart from some user education and training. And to give you an idea of kind of the breadth of the current installed base, there's something called EduGain, which is the, if you like, interfederation arrangement among all the academic research and education identity federations, and there are about they're greater than 5,000 institutions in EduGain, that represent, I heard recently, more than 30 million identities. Now, if institutions are not existing members of federations, what will they have to do? One of the things I think is tough about SAML in general is the coordination required to centralize identity management. And obviously for institutions, it's advantageous if they tie their SAML identity provider into a centralized identity management system, and that users can use one password across all of the applications they might consume, but it's not absolutely essential. And if libraries who don't have that shared centralized infrastructure today have proxy servers, and proxy servers are tied into some local patron authentication system, maybe the library OPAC or some other similar patron management system, there's no reason why that can't also be exposed as SAML identity provider. And in fact, one of the capabilities of the proxy servers is not to act as proxies, but to act as bridges between whatever local patron identity management system is on the back end and present that as a SAML IDP. What will service providers and publishers have to do? Again, not too much. Implement the common call to action, put that blue button on their site, and essentially that's just adding some JavaScript to your site. So that should be pretty straightforward for service providers. And then for the IDP discovery piece, as I mentioned, one of the things we're looking to do is stand up a central discovery service. And if you want to make use of that, that really is just a link. And that uses, again, an existing protocol called SAML Discovery. We expect that some of the bigger service providers will have more complex requirements and have to integrate other legacy mechanisms of authentication. So they might want to, or they probably already have their existing discovery systems, and they might want to adopt and implement the UI guidelines. And finally, a little bit more about the centralized infrastructure. As I mentioned, we're in the process of looking for a long-term home for this, for what we call the IDP persistence service. This is the ability to share that choice of identity provider across participants, and potentially a central discovery service. What needs to be done there, as I mentioned, really some hosting and maintenance of the centralized infrastructure. We think support and outreach to participants will be important. And obviously, everybody has to trust that central infrastructure. Everybody has to trust that domain. We're going to be incorporating the JavaScript hosted in that domain into our sites on the service provider side. So there probably has to be some legal framework around that to establish that trust. The criteria we established earlier in the year of the folks that we're talking to, we're looking for parties that are perceived as neutral by all of the key stakeholder groups, by the publishers, librarians, federation operators, obviously have the technical capabilities to support 24/7 high availability infrastructure, the experience in running that kind of critical infrastructure, willing and able to support a global model. We don't really want to have regional fragmentation here, and we need to establish a model for long-term financial stability. The costs here are fairly modest, but nevertheless, sustainable infrastructure needs a sustainable funding model, which we anticipate will be some contributing model from the stakeholder groups, and we're still figuring out the details of that. Our last slide, kind of the rollout strategy, and I think Todd alluded to this in his slides. We understand that this is not going to be a one-step leap to using the new approach to SAML with the recommendations we're making as the only authentication mechanism. So we anticipate initially we'll be aiming to encourage folks to use this mechanism for remote access, off-campus access as a supplement to IP. Increasingly, there's a group of customers for whom IP just doesn't work. So for increasingly corporate customers, moving to what I loosely call cloud ISPs, and people like Zscaler, these cloud ISPs are adopted both for efficiency, cost reduction, and security by customers. And essentially what they do is pool groups of IP access addresses across multiple customers, which means customers don't have unique IPs anymore, which means IPs can't be used for authentication. So increasingly, we're hearing from customers, I'm sure other service providers are, say, hey, we can't do IP, what else should we do? We encourage them to adopt the SAML approach with RA21. We think that that early experience will allow us, this kind of dual stack experience, will allow us to really measure and understand the success rates through the whole process of gaining access by this mechanism. And we think that will enable us to build an evidence base to say, look, this is as seamless and as easy to use as we expect it will be. It really isn't a problem for users. And eventually we see that as the path of finally letting go of IP. And with that, I'd like to invite my fellow speakers back up to the front. And I think also Leif Johansson from Sunet's going to join us, who's been a key technical partner. And hopefully we'll have some good questions and a good discussion.
So our speakers have done a great job running ahead of schedule, so I'm really looking forward to hearing your questions. Are there questions from the room? We have a microphone at the back. Could you introduce yourselves and let us read?
I'm Jerry McDonald. I'm from the Royal Pharmaceutical Society. One of my, we obviously publish as well. One of my questions, you talk about local cookie setting and using local cookies, I think, as a way of driving authentication, if I'm right in understanding that.
Right, I guess that's me. So we're actually not using cookies at all.
Okay.
We're using something called browser local store. It sounds like a very sort of new feature, but it's actually been around browsers in one version or another since Internet Explorer 6. So it's a long time ago. But what it actually allows you to do is it allows a site to store data for the user in the browser. So a cookie is sort of like the server side of that. So you're actually using a mechanism to associate data at the service. So this is so why people don't like cookies, is because it allows the service to independently access that data, right? You're storing essentially state. You're storing information about the user in your service. And the user is trusting you to keep the service, to keep track of that. Browser local store is the reverse of that. It's trusting the user to store their own data. And the browser security architecture that's sort of been around for a very long time ensures that that data cannot be accessed by any other site than the one you got it from. So it's a very, very high degree of confidence that not only are you trusting the user's device, but the user doesn't have to trust the service.
And if I could add a couple other things about that, is that the only thing that's stored in that local browser storage is basically the URL of your institutional login page. Your username is not in local browser storage. Your password is not in local browser storage. Your nothing personally identifiable at all is in that local browser storage. It's really just how do I get myself back to my institutional login page. That is what is essentially being stored there.
Just one more point on the level of security. It's the same mechanism that's used when you do an offline store of, let's say, Outlook web access. It's the same secure isolation mechanism. So people are definitely using it for much more detailed information. But in this case, it's not actually holding anything that's personal.
So that's great. So that's answered some of my security questions that I concern around cookie piece, of GDPR. You have to get that, but obviously there isn't one in this context.
No.
Another question then, actually, just if that's okay, we started off talking about the corporates, and then we went off and talked a lot about academic institutions and lists of academic institutions and your waiver pages. Where are you going to get all the information about the corporates if you want to put it into that? So we seem to start with corporates and then forget about corporates.
No. It is a good question, because the EduGain resource that Chris mentioned that we're pulling from is largely an aggregation of academic federations. So first of all, most publishers already have, many publishers already have their own what you call shibboleth discovery services, right? Where we have integrated both our, our academic and corporate subscriber information into that environment. So we will be making those services, we would say RA21 compliant, so that if you already have your own local discovery service, your own search environment, where you can find your institutions, there will be a way for those environments to basically plug into the RA21 ecosystem, so that that persistence can be stored in your local browser storage. If you can get that mental model in place. The other thing is, we are working with Leif, who has insights into the EduGain metadata, to also expand that EduGain metadata to include some of the corporate subscribers. And so, like, part of the corporate pilot that we did with Helen was we actually got SAML metadata from, I can't remember how many different participants, five of those pharma companies that we now have in the EduGain metadata as well. So that's definitely possible as well.
Anything to add?
I don't think so. I think it certainly is applicable to the corporate environment. I think one thing that's possibly unique in the corporate sector is that we're not so used to using federations, so we don't tend to have that. So that's something that we will need to look at even when we implement this. Our priority at the moment is around the user experience. But once we are comfortable with that, we would potentially implement this, as Chris noted, in a phased way outside the corporate network. And in order for us to do that, we'd need to look at either setting up or joining an existing federation.
We have questions coming in through the chat box, have we? We do. So Ken asks, how secure is publisher content secured? When will we get to the stage when we feel it'll be worth it's not a constructed sentence. When we feel it'll be worth commission an application or infrastructure penetration test. He thinks that would be a prerequisite to any kind of global adoption, being sure customer data is looked after and content is secured.
So this is Dan Ayala. So the notion of a penetration test, the pieces of code that exist are small, and it's basically a piece of JavaScript that interfaces with you, that is called by each of the subscribing publisher or service provider sites. We have taken a look at that code, and we'll continue to take a look at that code and make sure that it is functioning appropriately. But then it's up to each of the service providers that implement that code to maintain security of our own systems. So whereas Elsevier would run its penetration tests and various security protocols against its systems, ProQuest would do the same as the others. Beyond that, there's really no other central infrastructure to test with, which is one of the large positives of the approach that's taken by this project.
Exactly, and to add to that, I mentioned we had 2 academic pilots looking at 2 different implementation approaches, and what it essentially came down to is one was storing this IDP preference in browser local storage, and one was storing it in a centralized server infrastructure. And they were both viable technically, and in fact, in some ways, the server-side implementation was a little bit simpler, but obviously that involved having a simple but nonetheless centralized infrastructure that was subject to attack and compromise. And I think if you read the technology selection white paper, essentially that's what it came down to. We selected the browser local storage option because it has slightly better privacy characteristics and slightly better security characteristics.
So if I could maybe ask a follow-up, thanks for that.
So if I'm a Sci-Hub hacker, it's my job to fill the Sci-Hub library, and a student offers up, or a corporate person offers up their laptop with their authenticated browser. Can I take their, if I've got a login onto their system, can I take the stuff out of that browser and put it up on my Sci-Hub harvesting site?
You know, I think the really important thing to note here is that RA21 is not creating any additional data that publishers are storing or seeing than we have today through the shibboleth, access process. So, we're relying on standard SAML protocol, which has been in existence for 20 years. And so there's nothing being stored on that corporate or academic user's laptop that is of value. The only thing being stored is the URL of their login page. That is it. That is the only thing being stored here. So I really don't think this is increasing the the security and privacy report that we published really shows that this is not increasing the surface area for attack in any way or anything like that.
And I think it's worth saying that neither is it making it harder for hackers to compromise user credentials and access content, right? We're not making any statement about that. What we are doing is making it easier for users who have access to the legitimate resources to gain that access, and hopefully, and we anticipate reducing the need for users to then go to the malicious sites to get the content.
Yeah, I think I got the seamless access message. I'm just trying to explore what else it might do for me. I've implemented SAML many times for many corporate organizations. So yeah, it's 20-year-old technology. Yeah, but so that's fine. That confirmed what I thought. So great, thanks.
This is Todd Carpenter. Another rationale for this is if you have a login for the proxy server, which is different from your institutional login, which gets you access to your payroll system or your medical records or whatever else, you're more likely to care about passing on that credential than you would be to, oh, well, here's the library login, whatever, you could have that. But if somebody's going to say, well, here's the access to all of my grades and my accounting and, my university credit card, you're probably less likely to be willing to hand that over to someone in Russia so that Sci-Hub can get access to the library content.
But all that relates to human activity, not the technology.
Yeah, that's human security issues, which are always the most difficult to deal with.
Do you want to say something else and then we'll move to the question back?
Yeah, I sort of I didn't get exactly what was being sent over voice here. It's sort of breaking up a little bit, but I sort of heard you talking about where's on the other side here, talking about SAML specifically, and I think it's worth noting that none of what we've built is really tied to SAML at all. Now, this technology would work equally well with OpenID Connect, for instance. So we've got an activity among the federation operators right now looking at what would OpenID Connect look like in a wide federation world. And one of the activities there is looking at sort of discovery, sort of identifying where you log in. And it turns out that it looks exactly the same. So whatever we build here is going to be entirely future-proof for that.
Hi, Lawrence Jones, St George's University of London. In the last talk, you said that it's very cool publishers to set up RA21. I'm just wondering about society publishers, small ones, society, because they often lack technical know-how about how to set up authentication systems. So, do you have a strategy to or company?
Yeah, absolutely. Most of the smaller society publishers that we're talking about you're right, they have limited IT resources, and so therefore they're very likely working with a platform provider to provide their journal delivery environments. So they're working with folks like Highwire or Adapon or Silverchair. And we are absolutely tied into those platform providers. And I was just talking to Dave this morning about the fact that we need to start getting some of the API specifications to them so that those platform providers can start to build direct integrations between, like, what they would think of right now is their ship of discovery services. You know, that's where I said earlier about making those RA21 compliant so that those smaller publishers absolutely be able to participate in RA21.
And I'd also add that we tend to forget IP access is not a standardized authentication mechanism in the broader universe of the web, right? Something that's fairly peculiar to our industry. And it's not trivial to build an IP access management system, right? You have to build a database of IP addresses, the ability to manage that, et cetera, right? So every publishing platform since the mid-90s has had to do that. And that was effort that we tend to forget had to be invested and wasn't there already. So I suspect that 5 years down the line, we'll think of these mechanisms exactly the same way as that is just part of the furniture. And in fact, these are a little bit more standardized, a little bit more broadly adopted. So you actually can find, you know, software libraries that help you build this.
Just one more question, something about it. You said that, I can't remember which talk it was, that the libraries to adopt RA21 need more publishers to sign up to it. So how many publishers have signed up to it or expressed interest in signing up to it? You know, percentage.
Well, I think we mentioned that we had over 60 active participants in the project so far, and I think roughly a third of those are from publishers. I also, Heather, how many people have we got on our mailing list? 500, and again, a large third of those probably are publishers. So obviously there's an enormous long tail of publishers. I think there's about 5,000 academic publishers, but you've got most of the large publishers, when we mentioned at the start, actively participating and making this happen. So I suspect, like all of these things, publishing community has done a number of collaborative infrastructure projects before, things like Crossref, DOIs, ORCIDs. We tend to see a fairly standardized adoption curve where the biggest publishers are the initiators. Over a period of a couple of years, most of the large and medium-sized publishers come on board, and it takes longer for the small players to come on board.
Another question from the chat from Bill Bacon. What will be the user experience if the institution does not have access to the article that the user found on Google?
So that's an authorization question and not an authentication question, right? This is maybe the flippant answer. But what we're trying to do here is help the publishing platform figure out which institution the user's from, right? It's then entirely up to them what they do if the user doesn't have authorization entitlements to the specific article in question. So that's a publisher-specific question.
Question back there.
Hi there, I'm Richard, also from Elsevier. I think I know part of the answer to this question, but I'm really curious to know the whole answer. So the local storage approach means that you can share the answer to the question, where are you from, between publisher A and publisher B and publisher C. And that triangulation between the publishers, and this is like the infrastructure that you mentioned that allows that the answer to the wave question to be triangulated. That relies on access to that's the same approach that advertisers sometimes use when they are following you around the internet, and that's like you web. And except that the RA21 approach is using that same approach, but for good rather than for advertising. So because of the advertising tendency to use this approach, some browsers like Firefox and Safari and so on are adding features that prevent or provide options by default to not share access to third-party data. And I'm wondering what effect we see those features having on the UX, because sometimes you have to visit third-party domain and so on. When we've done any research or testing in that area.
Yeah, I can take that. So that's absolutely right. And currently, Safari is sort of taking the most strict approach here, and I think other browsers will probably do that too. And I think that what we would see in the UX is we will have to send users to some page served by the main domain of this service, whatever it's going to be, that essentially tells the user what we're doing. So when sort of a good thing, actually, because we're going to be forced by browsers to be very upfront with what we're doing. Even though it may look like a GDPR thing, it actually isn't. It has nothing to do with personal information. We're still not processing personal information. But we're going to stick some information or one piece of information in the browser local store. And we're going to have to tell the user that we're doing it, which arguably is a good thing, right? And I think that's the answer. We're doing it. Arguably, we could sort of select to do it only for the browsers that insist on it. But there's an argument to doing it for all browsers, just because it's good to be open about these things. So, but that's still a discussion, and it's part of the current UX.
Yeah, and we don't have that developed yet, but you can think of that as kind of just an informational page that really just describes, okay, what is RA21? What are we actually doing here? What data is being stored in your local browser storage? And really, we direct users initially to an informational page like that is just being very transparent about what it is that they're getting to. And we also overcome the problem that Richard talked about.
And I think just one thing to add to that, it also depends on whether you're using the central discovery service or a local discovery service, because essentially the central discovery service is a page on the shared domain which you visit in the workflow.
So in fact, the user experience would probably be slightly better for users for the smaller publishers, actually, for users who are, or for sites that are calling the default discovery UI and not providing their own.
Okay, we have a backlog of questions in chat.
Excellent.
So Luke asks, how can RA21 encourage publishers to implement support for SAML?
Well, I think most publishers do already, and most publishing platforms do already. So, and again, the core mechanism for the ones that don't will be through the publishing platform vendors, and we've had very active participation already from Atacom, one of the key vendors in the pilot, and definitely one of the tasks going forward is to involve the other vendors. And obviously, we should also talk to people like OJPS who run the open source publishing platforms. But again, this kind of adoption curve is not new. There's pretty broad support now for ORCIDs during manuscript submission. That didn't exist 5 years ago. There's ubiquitous support for DOIs and Crossref. That didn't exist 10 years ago, right? So once this starts to build momentum, it will, I think, follow the same adoption curve.
And if there is customer interest, that drives what publishers do.
Yeah.
So how the customers are interested, please, users, libraries are interested, please let the publishers know.
Another question out of chat from Martin Williamson. Why is there a need for the blue button once the user has logged in for the first time? Can this step be removed or made seamless?
That is an excellent question, and it's a trade-off. There's absolutely no reason why, once that IDP choice is known, the user couldn't automatically be sent to their IDP to sign in and come back again, apart from the fact that the IDP may have gone away, or it may be broken, or there may be a problem with DNS resolution, and then the user gets stuck. So I think that's certainly something we can experiment with over time, but this is kind of the safe approach that if there is a problem with the IDP, the user can click back and maybe they have other options.
And it also supports the notion of multi-institutional support, so that you can, if you need to log in through a specific institution, let's say you're part of more than one, you can use that as the point to decide whether or not to go to a different institution or continue on to the one that's been pre-saved.
There's actually another argument. I mean, apart from the fact that users sometimes make mistakes, I think select the wrong IDP. But also, there are good UX reasons for having a login button in the first place, because you don't always want to authenticate. And the whole notion of always authenticated that we're sort of getting used to via the mobile platforms isn't actually in the interest of user privacy. And having a choice when I want to authenticate, like the only thing that I'm retaining here is the information of where I authenticate if I choose to do so. But I still have the choice of not authenticating. And so if you're following sort of that general principle, you're going to have a button somewhere that says login. And you might as well have that button do something a little bit more intelligent than just send you to a choice page. And that's the whole notion.
Okay, next one from Jos Kosude. Can RA21 set up recommendations about how to establish the federated SSO connection between the library and a publisher, which attributes to exchange, for example? It would be great for libraries when making deals with publishers to refer to RA21 about setting up the SSO connection. Joe saw something on that slide from Ralph about the opaque persistent identifier role. Could that be a standard set of data?
Let me take a step at that. I think that's actually an excellent idea. We haven't really explored it in the project because we've been focusing on the user, the usability aspects of this. But I think there are good venues to have that discussion, and I think it's an excellent idea to sort of standardize like the publisher institution relationship in terms of what data you release. We've done it for other in the academic community, the federation operator community. We've done it for other types of services where we've standardized, for a research platform owned by the community. Then we've sort of standardized the types of attributes that should be released. There's no reason we couldn't do the same thing for the institution publisher relationship, and I think it would be a good idea.
And this is Todd. This is not necessarily a publisher institution question. This is an internal institutional question about what attributes library services are exposing, which is different from other SAML applications that an institution might be using. It could be a conversation between publishers, but really it should be more driven internally within the institution to say, for these set of publisher/library services, here's a profile of attribute release that could be standardized. The publisher community could have a voice in that, but it's really an institutional question, more so than a publisher question.
I think that's exactly right, and I think those are the fora that should own this question. For instance, there's something called the reference community. It's an organization facilitated by GEON, European Union-funded organization that organizes all of the research networks and also all of the academic federations. And in the reference group, there's been standardization work that looks like this, but for other types of services. It would be a relatively straightforward exercise to do the same thing for library services and publishers. Yeah. And I think if there's a suitable number of publishers turn up and say, hey, could we facilitate this? I think we have.
Yeah, and I'd also add, I mean, there's already kind of a norm around this. It's just not been expressed formally as an attribute bundle. And there was some work done 10 years ago. And essentially, I think most publishers expect an entitlement attribute, and there's agreements on what that should be. Say, hey, yeah, this user should get the library resources, and an optional opaque user identifier, what we call today EduPerson targeted ID. So I think it will be really useful for that to be standardized, because certainly what we find happening is that due to the lack of that, we actually get more data. We tend to get often what's called the R&E bundle released to us, which includes things like name and email address, that we actually don't want. I mean, we're happy to have users register with us, but we'd like them to then tell us what their email address is if they would like to do that, rather than have that, pass transparently behind the scenes.
And there was a conversation earlier this year, Ann West from the Internet 2 suggested building on, I think, some of the Refed's work on badging and creating profiles that could be built into these systems that say, if you agree to these terms, then you can get access to this additional attribute release, which is more than nothing, but is certainly not name, email address, social security number, et cetera, whatever is in your systems. That is, I think, a really useful conversation to have, but we need to get the infrastructure built in order for that system to move forward.
There's another question in the room. Two questions in the room.
Is that microphone working?
Hello.
Yeah.
You said a question last IT question regarding China. Have you done any testing with institutions there, or do you see any issues with it operating that kind of?
We actually found contacts in, so for instance, first of all, Corsi, Chinese, one of the, I think, two big Chinese federations are in the process of building endlane, so they will certainly be sort of part of the service scope of this. And we did develop some contacts inside Corsi that we're willing to help with facilitate user testing. I'm not sure we actually have time to go and touch base with them. But, I think it's still a possibility.
Another question behind.
Hi again. I wanted to ask a quick follow-on to the one that was just before about standardizing the attributes of brilliance and then asking a quick additional one. With OAuth, the user is presented with a screen saying, this service would like this attribute, this attribute. Do you consent to it? Often you can sort of untick a couple of those and then be sent back and so on. I know that that's something that has been talked about in this sandwich area. It's probably something that would be quite hard to convince the tens of thousands of IDPs to adopt in one fell swoop. And I'm wondering if that's something that would be useful to begin encouraging. I know there's some. The other thing I just wanted to quickly ask, which kind of relates this way, both Todd and Chris mentioned that science papers aren't the only resources that libraries let their patrons access. But I'm wondering to what extent those other resources are also, to what extent anonymity is central to those access use cases as well. When you're a researcher accessing a radio telescope, does the radio telescope need to know who you are, or just who you're from the university, right? And similarly, these other systems, to what extent is an anonymity system there as well?
So I'm actually going to take that one, because one of the groups I work with is LIGO, the Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory folks. And they actually find access to the measuring equipment to be the single most important thing that they must track. There's no anonymity there. They have to know exactly who's reached that to the point of they will establish their own authentication platform just for that, so that they can control it and know who's done what. What's at risk if they don't is announcing discoveries being able to say, yes, that this professor did this, and therefore this professor is the one that gets the Nobel Prize. Now, other data sets that once they've gone through the embargo process, because a lot of the funding agencies will say, okay, you can have it to be your private collaborations data, but only for 2 years, which point it must be open. Then the access to the data, you have that moment of if you must be able to track who's allowed to have access, and then it flips to, and then it becomes public. So a lot of those other things, it's actually, I think, way more important to know who and not just what kind of person it is us.
Sorry, maybe to follow up on that, one of the nice things here is entity categories can be used to drive attribute bundles for release as a standard. But multiple categories of entities or IDPs and service providers can participate in the shared discovery persistence, right? So that's what I was particularly referencing, right? That the radio telescope might want your name, rank, and serial number. The publisher might just want the entitlement attribute, but we can both share the knowledge that it's your ID provider at University of London that's going to provide that information for you, right? So that's where the scaling comes in. You also asked about the kind of attribute release consent. I don't know if Leif, you could speak more to that.
Yeah. So this goes back about 10 years in the Federation Operator community, or even longer, I think. Early on, there was a lot more focus on sort of that kind of user-managed consent among the IEP operators, and there's been a lot of software developed and a lot of attempts to deploy it. And in the end, I think most of the time, the legal foundation for releasing attributes are not consent-based in many cases in the university environment. Right? You're sending data to the payroll system because you're an employee, and you're sending data to the radio telescope because it's in the interest of the data subject to do so. Right? There are very few situations outside of the consumer service environment where consent is appropriate. And it's also worth noting that in the OAuth scenarios that we all recognize those kinds of consent screens, when you set up your Google accounts and whatnot. You're actually allowing the service provider to continuously refresh that information too, right? So you're not only providing a one-off sort of access to here's what my email address is right now, you're allowing that service provider to keep refreshing and updating and even sending email in your name, right? So it's like sometimes it's a much wider access that you're really providing. But in the R&D federations, we've never worked with those kinds of technical categories, or very, very seldom. And also, attribute release is typically done at the interest of the data subject, not because of consent. And consent is often either confusing or borderline illegal because it's not actually free and informed. In the sense of GDPR, you actually have to understand what you're being asked to do and be able to say no, right? And logging into your payroll system or your university portal, you can't actually say no to that. Otherwise, you can't be an employee. So there are very few corner cases where free and informed consent is actually appropriate. And I don't think I think the library situation might actually be one of those corner cases. I don't know, but it's by no means a clear-cut case.
The other thing I'll add is that from a corporate perspective, the use of oftentimes the user doesn't necessarily have the right to make those decisions. Even beyond the payroll system, think about the connection of personal information or corporate information to a third party that may or may not be authorized. And then also the human nature, we've used OAuth. People have been presented with OAuth for so long, and human nature is to say, yeah, sure. This is more of a personal belief. We spend too much time spending, just saying sure and sending it all. Whereas maybe if we want to be in this project as transparent and as explicit with opt-in as possible, having the user go and actually enter it themselves is the surest way to make sure that that's what they intended to do.
Any other questions in the room?
Yeah, Phil Lee from Open Athens. I just want to come back to the question of publisher adoption, because, I mean, in answer to the earlier question, Chris said, well, most publishers are doing this already, and Dan said, well, the customer rules. As somebody who talks to business folk and product managers at many publishers around the world, I don't consider that to be universal truth. I completely accept that there has to be a certain level of customer requirement for a publisher to do something. But I guess I'm just wondering in a wider sense, certainly with the multinational groups like OCB, and there are others, just the way that the corporate structures are, those product managers have complete autonomy and independence. Now, I mean, Chris's personal fiefdom of the Science Direct Group and associated products, clearly there's a mandate that we are just going to do this. But in the wider SDA group, that's typically the case. And as I said, corporate structures will actively find it. So I wondered if this is outside RA21's remit or even indeed control. I just wondered if there's recognition of maybe a requirement for evangelizing or outreach across the wider corporate groups to help disseminate this stuff.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. I don't think it is a formal requirement, but I think innately as a part of the work that we've done on the project, most of the players have been doing that evangelization at every turn. There's a reason we spend a lot of time having these kinds of discussions amongst library constituencies, publisher constituencies, and others, and then driving the message internally. I made a comment earlier about active participation leads to larger adoption, larger ownership. And I think this project is one of those cases where the breadth of involvement from 60 different organizations will give it the best chance for widest adoption. Can it be guaranteed? Of course, nothing's guaranteed.
Yeah. And I would add, I mean, I agree that outreach and evangelism is going to be needed. That's one of the things we're looking for the follow-on organization or the follow-on infrastructure provider to provide. So absolutely, webinars, training sessions, all that good stuff. And again, I'll just reiterate that there is a pattern here. We know as an industry in publishing how to get new infrastructure adopted, and it takes 3 to 5 years to get far down the long tail. And I'm pretty convinced that's exactly the same thing that's going to happen here.
Well, and speaking for NISO, this process of standardization is like every other product lifecycle. You have interest, you have early adopters, you have late adopters. It takes a lot of time, effort, and energy to get things adopted. It's a process. You don't just publish a standard, put it on the shelf, and say we're done. You have to go out and evangelize. You have to go out and do outreach. You have to do training, support. This is what it is. This is how you do it. You have to hold people's hands. And we, RA21, have this a big element of the infrastructure support organization model that we're going to talk about this afternoon in terms of governing RA21 moving forward. A big component of that is outreach and evangelizing, because it is going to take some time. I mean, it's not going to take a lot of time to get Elsevier or ACS on board with this. It's going to take a lot longer time to get the Linnean Society on board, or some of these smaller academic publishers that are maintaining their own small in-house systems. We know that. That's the case with Counter. That's the case with Sushi. That's the case with any number of existing standards in our community. But if you look to, say, for example, DOI, Crossref has now, I think it's 4,000, 5,000 members, and that growth from 0 to 100 took a little while, a couple of years. But it wasn't until about 10 years later that it went from 1,000 to 4,000. So we are looking at a 10-year project here at least to get this widely adopted. And knowing that we need to commit to it and investing the resources necessary to get us to that stage is a core component of what we need to do.
Chris, I have a question. Well, it's not a question. Would you like to share the information about what we're doing in the medical and clinical environment? And the reasons?
Sure. So, I mean, that's a concern that's been raised as we've talked about RA21 over the past 6 months to a year. How's this going to work for people at points of care? How's this going to work in hospital environments? So we have set up another working group looking at the needs there specifically. And it's in fairly early stages. Fundamentally, there's nothing. People often say, well, a doctor who's got a patient in the emergency department bleeding on the table doesn't have time to sign in. This is absolutely true. And solutions already exist at points of care to authenticate people in clinical settings using proximity cards and things, so they don't have to do that. And there's nothing about the technology that we're adopting, right, SAML, that requires a user to type a username and password into a box. They just need to authenticate, and it's very flexible at how they authenticate. So the clinical working groups we set up to really get those needs on the table. And I think that there are different needs depending on the setting, whether it's a clinician who's in a research setting at their desk versus a clinician at point of care. And we need to get those needs on the table and figure out how the existing technologies that are being worked on in that space for improving authentication can be tied into what we're doing. But fundamentally, so far, there's nothing about the technology that seems to indicate that that won't be possible.
Any other questions in the room? Any online? No.
Great. Well, thanks so much for all the questions. It's really great to have such a good discussion, and I think we nearly used up all the time. So thanks so much.
So if you'd like to hang around, you have experts you can ask questions of, and we just use the network and mingle and, as I say, ask questions. Thanks very much. Chris, if you could forward the slide.
Clearly not. Try pressing a button.
So if you need more information, visit the website, contact Heather or myself, and Chris and Ralph are in there in small letters. Thanks very much, everybody.